So, today we're going to dive into one of the most brilliant and honestly savage intellectual battles in all of history. It's a story about a book written for one reason and one reason only: to completely dismantle another book, point by point, argument by argument. This isn't just some dusty old debate, it's a philosophical showdown for the ages. And if you've ever been curious about the great books of philosophy, well, this is the perfect place to start. Okay, just listen to this quote. This is our guy, Averroes, basically throwing down the gauntlet. He's looking at a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers and saying, you know what? This book is so messy, so full of contradictions. The real incoherence is coming from the guy who wrote it, not from philosophy itself. That one sentence just perfectly captures the sharp, confrontational energy of his entire project. All right, so for Averroes' book, which is a defense, to make any sense, we first have to understand the attack. Before you can have a rebuttal, you need a powerful case for the prosecution, a case made against the very soul of philosophy. So let's set the scene. Picture this. It's the 11th century Islamic world, and the works of ancient Greek masters, guys like Aristotle, have just been translated into Arabic. Their impact was, as one scholar put it, sudden, violent, and short. You've got this new wave of rational thought, led by these thinkers called the philosophers, and it's creating some serious tension. They're using pure reason to ask the biggest questions out there about God, creation, the universe, and that put them on a direct collision course with traditional theology. And this is where our two main players come in. In one corner, you have Al-Ghazali. He's one of the most respected theologians in Islam, and he sees this new reliance on reason as a super dangerous path, one that leads people away from their faith. So he writes a book to prove it, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. Then, about a century later, in the other corner, you have Averroes. He's a diehard philosopher, totally devoted to Aristotle, and he decides to step up and defend reason by writing his own masterpiece with that incredible title, The Incoherence of the Incoherence. Now, Ghazali's attack was absolutely devastating. He basically said that philosophers were making this false promise. They claimed their big ideas about reality had the same rock-solid certainty as math. But Ghazali called them out. He said, look, if your proofs are so good, why can't any of you agree with each other? For him, philosophy wasn't built on evidence. It was built on supposition and opinion, and all its contradictions were proof of just how weak it really was. Ghazali's book was a knockout punch to philosophy in the Islamic world. Seriously, for about 100 years, it really seemed like that was the final word on the matter. But then, a new champion for reason stepped into the ring. You see, Averroes looked at Ghazali's work and thought, this isn't just an attack on a few ideas. This is a complete and total misunderstanding of what philosophy is even trying to do. So he decided to do something pretty incredible. He didn't just write a vague response. No, he took Ghazali's book and refuted it systematically, point by point, to prove that the incoherence wasn't in philosophy, but in Ghazali's own arguments against it. And his method was just relentless. For every single one of the 20 points Ghazali made, Averroes followed the same game plan. First, he'd quote Ghazali directly, so there's no way he could be accused of twisting his words. Then he would just meticulously pick apart all the logical mistakes. And finally, he'd present what he saw as the correct philosophical proof. This systematic takedown makes his book more than just a piece of history. It's a masterclass in how to build an argument. So to really see how this epic duel of minds played out, let's zoom in on the single biggest point of disagreement between them, the one issue Ghazali spent nearly a quarter of his entire book on. It really all boils down to this one fundamental question. Did the world pop into existence at some specific moment in time, or has it just always been here? The way you answer that question reveals everything about the divide between the theologian and the philosopher. It gets to the very heart of how we understand reality itself. So Ghazali, who is representing the orthodox religious view, argues for what's called temporal creation. The idea is that God, through a sheer act of will, just created the world out of absolute nothingness at a particular moment. Before that moment, no time, no space, no world, nothing, just God. This is the bedrock of creation as understood by faith. But Averroes, following Aristotle's logic, defends eternal creation. For the philosophers, this wasn't really a matter of belief, it was a matter of pure logic. Think about it. If you have an eternal and unchanging cause, that's God, then that cause must produce an eternal effect, that's the world. If God is eternal and perfect, his act of creating must also be eternal. Therefore, the world has always existed. Okay, let's really get into the weeds here, because the arguments these two thinkers used are some of the most profound and mind-bending in the entire history of thought. All right, so the crux of it is that each side backed the other into a logical corner with a seemingly impossible paradox. Ghazali posed this problem to the philosophers. If the world is eternal, that means an infinite number of days and years have already passed to get to right now. But, he argued, you can't complete an infinite series. It's impossible. It's like trying to count to infinity and actually arriving at a final number. But then Averroes fired back with his own paradox for the theologians. Okay, so if the world had a beginning, that means there was a time when God hadn't created yet. So, what changed? What new idea or impulse made God suddenly decide to act? For a perfect and eternal being to change its mind like that implies an imperfection, and a perfect being can't change. At the very core of the philosopher's argument was this idea of potentiality. See, in Aristotelian physics, nothing can come from absolute nothing. Everything that comes into being is just something that was already potentially there, becoming actually there. A block of marble, for example, has the potential to become a statue. So for them, the idea of creation out of pure, empty nothingness, it was just a logical impossibility. It didn't make sense. But Ghazali's response to this was frankly brilliant. He argued that Averroes was trying to put God in a box, to bind him with the rules of human logic. But God's will is absolute. It comes before logic, before time. God isn't limited by reasons that exist in the world. His will is what creates those reasons in the first place. So why did God create the world at that specific moment? The answer is simple, because he willed it. For the theologians, the paradox of creation isn't a problem to be solved with logic. It's a mystery that points to the infinite power of God. So who won? Well, in the short term, you'd have to say Ghazali did. But the long-term impact of this debate, its echo through the centuries, traveled in completely different directions, ultimately shaping two very different civilizations. Ghazali's powerful defense of faith was a massive triumph in the Islamic East. It really solidified the dominance of theology over philosophy for centuries to come. Averroes, on the other hand, was pretty much forgotten in his own culture. But, and this is a huge but, over in Europe, the exact opposite happened. His detailed, logical commentaries on Aristotle were translated into Latin and became the fuel for the intellectual fires of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. He became so important they just called him the commentator, a foundational figure for all of Western philosophy. And all of this leaves us with a final thought. This 12th century fight between faith and reason, between tradition and logic, it's not just some historical curiosity, is it? It's a fundamental conflict that we still see playing out today in so many different ways. So the question their epic struggle really leaves for us is this. When the pillars of ancient wisdom are challenged by the power of new ideas, which path should we choose to guide us forward? The answer is just as tough now as it was back then.